June 1944. A Soviet tank commander named Dmitry Loza advances 100 km in a single day during Operation Bagration. His unit overruns unprepared German rear echelon troops who never saw the Red Army coming. Crews fall asleep at their controls. Tanks break down from exhaustion. German supply depots burn while their occupants flee in panic. This wasn't luck. This wasn't overwhelming numbers. This was deep battle doctrine in action. A sophisticated military theory that would destroy Army Group Center. Kill or capture 350,000 German soldiers and advance 600 km in 5 weeks. The Soviets, the genius Stalin executed, didn't just outfight the Wehrmacht, they outthought them. But first, Stalin would murder the men who created it. Late 1920s Moscow. A brilliant Soviet officer named Mikhail Tukhachevsky is solving a problem that will define modern warfare. How do you break through enemy lines and keep going? How do you turn tactical victory into strategic collapse? His answer, deep battle doctrine, would eventually destroy the Wehrmacht. But first, Stalin would have him shot. Tukhachevsky wasn't working alone. Vladimir Trianfil developed thematical backbone, calculating exact operational depth and tempo. How many kilometers per day? How many tons of supplies? How many echelons of troops you needed to not just break through but keep going until the enemy's entire defensive system shattered. Meanwhile, Georgy is focused on mechanized warfare. He choreographed successive waves of armor and infantry to maintain unbroken offensive momentum. Tanks wouldn't just punch holes. They'd exploit deep into enemy rear areas, destroying reserves and command posts before the enemy could recover. This wasn't improvisation. It was rigorous operational science designed to avoid World War I's attritional bloodbaths. The doctrine emphasized continuous deep operations, not frontal assaults, but coordinated multi-echelon attacks penetrating enemy lines, then exploiting hundreds of kilometers into the rear. It was sophisticated, forward-thinking, Stalin-esque purges. A doctrine destroyed, exactly what the Red Army would desperately need. Then came the purges. Between 1937 and 1938, Stalin's paranoia consumed the Red Army's intellectual core. Tukhachevsky was executed June 11, 1937, age 44. Tryan-Dylov had died in a 1931 plane crash, but his students were imprisoned or shot. Iserson was arrested in 1941, approximately 30,000 officers purged. Deep battle doctrine was sidelined as politically suspect, associated with enemies of the people. The theories were suppressed, manuals removed from circulation. The Red Army was left doctrinally bankrupt, just as the greatest test in its history approached. When Operation Barbarossa struck on June 22, 1941, the consequences were catastrophic. Without deep battle emphasis on coordination and operational depth, Soviet defensive lines collapsed. By late 1941, the Red Army had suffered Operation Barbarossa, the cost of forgetting millions of casualties. Entire armies were encircled and destroyed at Kiev and Smolensk. The Wehrmacht advanced hundreds of kilometers in weeks. By December 1941, the Red Army stood bloodied before Moscow, millions dead, vast territories lost. Soviet high command faced a choice: continue dying using outdated tactics or resurrect the forbidden theories of themen Stalin had murdered. Desperation would prove a powerful teacher. Facing existential crisis in 1942, Soviet high command did something remarkable. They admitted their executed theorists had been right. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the man who defended Moscow in December 1941, and Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, now chief of the General Staff, began the resurrection of a forbidden idea, quietly resurrecting Tukhachevsky's forbidden concepts. They restructured entire army groups, rewrote operational doctrine, all while the Wehrmacht still occupied Soviet soil. The theories that had gotten men shot in 1937 would now become the blueprint for destroying Hitler's armies. The transformation was systematic. Vasilevsky restructured formations into fronts. Massive strategic commands, coordinating multiple combined arms armies across hundreds of kilometers. From 1943 onward, they introduced dedicated tank armies, purpose-built, exploitation forces designed to punch through enemy lines and rampage deep into German rear areas, rebuilding the Red Army. Tanks and echelons. Over 57,000 T-34 tanks rolled off production lines during the war. Their sloped armor, up to 65mm thick, and diesel engines outclassed early German panzers, while remaining cheap enough to mass produce at $135,000 to 170,000 rubles each. But deep battle wasn't about throwing tanks forward and hoping. The doctrine became rigorously echelon first. Echelon rifle corps and divisions would break into enemy defensive belts through concentrated artillery fire, and combined arms assault second. Echelon mechanized and tank formations would then exploit the breach, driving deep while the enemy was still reeling. Reserve echelons stood ready to reinforce success or pivot to new opportunities. This wasn't human waves. It was coordinated depth, mathematical and ruthless. Integration became everything. Soviet Moskarovka deception evolved into an art form. Fake troop movements, dummy tanks, false radio traffic, all designed to make the Germans look the wrong way. Extensive reconnaissance mapped enemy defenses and identified weak points before the first shot was fired. Artillery, air power, and engineer units synchronized their efforts to breach the dense defensive belts the Germans had learned to construct. Yet Zhukov's own memoirs reveal heated debates over timing, scope, and logistical risks. Some commanders advocated caution, incremental advances rather than deep the test. The Battle of Kursk penetrations without sufficient reserves. The doctrine demanded calculated risk, not blind faith. The learning curve was brutal. The 1942 Regev offensives, the RJV meat grinder demonstrated this savagely. Deep battle applied prematurely without adequate forces or preparation resulted in catastrophic Soviet casualties and minimal gains. Hundreds of thousands dead. The doctrine had limits, and mastering it required blood and failure before triumph. But by summer 1943, the restructured Red Army faced its greatest test. At a place called Kursk, July 1943, German commanders launched their largest offensive since Barbarossa, Operation Citadel. They're aiming to encircle and destroy Soviet forces in the Kursk salient. Regain strategic initiative, turn the tide. They're about to learn that deep battle works in defense too. Soviet intelligence, including the Lucispy Ring and partisan reconnaissance, identified German offensive plans weeks in advance. This allowed construction of defensive belts up to 300 km deep. Over 5,000 Soviet tanks positioned in echelon reserves. The defensive phase demonstrated doctrinal maturity. Rather than defending at the front line, Soviet forces absorbed German attacks in depth. German armor exhausted itself against successive defensive belts, while Soviet reserves remained uncommitted, waiting, calculating. War correspondent Vasily Giman documented the human reality. Soviet sappers crawling through minefields at midnight, their hands shaking as they probed the earth inch by inch. They knew dawn tank breakthroughs depended on their survival. The deafening artillery barges, the psychological toll of waiting in reserve. While the front lines absorbed punishment, German casualties reached 50,000 to 60,000. They lost 300 to 400 tanks. The Wehrmacht failed to achieve breakthrough. Then the Red Army launched devastating counteroffensives. Operations Kutus and Polvodets. Rumenstve liberated Orel on August 5th, Belgar on August 5th, Kharkov on August 23rd. The Katusha rocket launcher firstest in July 1941 at Orsa, where it destroyed a German supply station and shocked enemy troops, reached maturity at Kursk. Over 10,000 launchers produced, the engine of victory, Soviet logistics and industry during the war. Its area saturation and psychological impact earned it the nickname Stalin's organ. The shriek became iconic of Soviet firepower. Soviet strategic initiative was established for the remainder of the war. Deep battle had proven itself in both defensive and offensive modes. The Red Army could absorb the blow, then transition seamlessly to offense. The Germans couldn't counter it. But Kursk was just the beginning. The doctrine that looked brilliant on paper now needed industrial muscle to sustain it across 600 km of operational depth. Paper doesn't advance 600 km. The Soviets built something the Germans never could. A logistical system capable of delivering 7,000 tons of supplies daily to multiple army groups simultaneously. This was industrial warfare perfected. During the major 1944 offensives, Soviet fronts received 5,000 to 7,000 tons of supplies per day via rail. The Red Army operated over 100,000 km of military railways through a dedicated service called the Voins Helaraga. Every month they delivered 100,000 to 150,000 tons of fuel and 200,000 to 300,000 tons of ammunition to the front. The Wehrmacht had nothing comparable. German logistics were still dependent on horses. Literally millions of horses struggling through Russian mud while Soviet trains ran day and night. But logistics meant nothing without equipment. Here, the Soviet industrial machine demonstrated terrifying efficiency. Over 57,000 T-34 tanks rolled off production lines during the war. Each cost 135,000 to 170,000 rubles. Their sloped armor and diesel engines outclassed early German tanks and proved reliable enough that centralized repair facilities could return 2,000 to 3,500 tanks to service monthly through repairs and rebuilding. Not new production, but sustained operational strength. Add 10,000 Katyusha rocket launchers for devastating area saturation. Add 36,000 IL-2 Sturmovich ground attack aircraft, the most produced military aircraft of World War II, providing Operation Bagration. Annihilation by Doctrine, devastating close air support that suppressed German infantry, armor, and artillery during breakthrough and exploitation phases. The Germans obsessed over these numbers, but they missed the point. This wasn't just about producing tanks. It was about sustaining multi-echelon operations over hundreds of kilometers. Deep battle doctrine required second and third echelon forces to have fuel, ammunition, and replacements waiting when they arrived. The Red Army maintained replacement pools of 400,000 men at any given time during 1944 to 45. They sent 1.5 million replacements to the front in 1944 alone. When a tank army broke through, it didn't stop because it ran out of shells or fuel. It kept going. Maintained by a logistical system the Wehrmacht couldn't match and couldn't stop. With doctrine refined and logistics in place, the Red Army was ready to demonstrate what deep battle could accomplish at full scale. The target Army Group Center, the Operation Bagration. The result, one of the most devastating military defeats in history, June 23, 1944. German commanders and Army Group Center are confident the main Soviet summer offensive will strike further south. They're catastrophically wrong. Within 24 hours, Soviet artillery tears gaps in their lines. Within a week, German units are fleeing eastward faster than they'd advanced in 1941. Within 2 months, Army Group Center ceases to exist. Operation Bagration wasn't improvisation. It was deep battle doctrine executed with mathematical precision. The mature expression of everything Tukhachevsky had envisioned 2 decades earlier. For weeks before the offensive, Soviet reconnaissance teams mapped every German strongpoint, minefield, and reserve position, debunking the human wave. Myth meanwhile. Maskirovka deception operations, fake troop movements, dummy tanks, carefully orchestrated radio traffic, convinced German intelligence the main blow would fall in Ukraine hundreds of kilometers south. When the storm finally broke on June 23 across Belarus, the Germans were looking the wrong way. The Soviet force was massive, over 2.3 million troops, 5,200 tanks, 300 aircraft across 4 coordinated fronts. 1st Baltic, 3rd Belarusian, 2nd Belarusian, 1st Belarusian. But this wasn't about overwhelming numbers. It was about operational sophistication. The offensive unfolded exactly as doctrine prescribed. Massed artillery pulverized German defensive belts. First echelon rifle divisions smashed through the shattered lines. Then came the tank armies, those dedicated exploitation forces created in 1943, pouring through the gaps and racing deep into German rear areas. This was operational art, not brute force. Synchronized, echelon. Devastating. Tank commander Dmitry Loza later described his unit's advance during Bagration. 100 kilometers covered in a single day. Crews so exhausted they fell, the legacy of deep battle asleep at their stations during brief halts. Tanks breaking down from their relentless pace. The surreal experience of overrunning German supply depots and headquarters whose occupants had no idea Soviet armor was anywhere near them. The exploitation phase moved faster than German commanders could process what was happening. The numbers tell the story of annihilation. Soviet casualties 765,000 total, including 178,000 killed or missing and 587,000 wounded. Substantial losses, but sustainable given the strategic outcome. German casualties 350,000 to 400,000 killed, wounded, missing, with Army Group Center effectively ceasing to exist as a fighting force. In just over 2 months, the Red Army advanced more than 600 kilometers. They liberated Belarus, eastern Poland, and the Baltic states. Minsk fell July 3rd, Vilnius July 13th. By August, Soviet forces reached the Vistula River. The German Central Front collapsed entirely. Soviet strategic dominance was secured for the remainder of the war. Bagration wasn't an anomaly. It was deep battle doctrine executed with precision, the culmination of years of learning, restructuring, and industrial mobilization. But what did this sophistication look like for the men inside the tanks? The engineers clearing minefields. Under fire, the civilians caught in the operational depth behind. Every operational arrow on the map was a Soviet sapper crawling through a minefield at midnight. Tank crew driving until their vehicle broke down from exhaustion, a family fleeing. Their burning village with minutes warning. Deep battle sophistication didn't eliminate chaos. It channeled chaos into operational art that the Germans couldn't counter. War correspondent Vasile Guimon observed Soviet sappers clearing minefields under fire at night at Kursk, their hands shaking as they probed the earth inch by inch. knowing that dawn tank breakthroughs depended on their survival. Tank commander Dmitry Loza described his unit advancing 100 km in a single day. During Bagration, the exhilaration of breakthrough, followed by exhaustion, so complete that crews fell asleep at their controls. Vehicles breaking down from mechanical fatigue while German rear echelon units fled in panic. Letters from rank and file. Soldiers describe chaos, fear, and elation in equal measure during those rapid advances. Viktor Nekrasov's in the trenches of Stalingrad captured the ground-level reality. The contrast between high command strategic vision and the mud, blood, and confusion of actual combat. And in Ukraine, Grossman documented families fleeing burning villages with minutes' warning, caught between retreating Germans destroying everything and advancing Soviets reshaping the landscape through operational depth. This is where we confront the persistent myth directly. Soviet success wasn't about human wave attacks or mindless numerical superiority. Detailed operational records from 1943 onward prove meticulous planning. Combined arms, sophistication and operational surprise, not frontal assaults. Yes, early war Soviet attacks were costly and disorganized. The 1942 Raj offensives demonstrated this brutally. Deep battle applied prematurely resulted in catastrophic casualties and minimal gains. But by 1943–45, late-war offensives minimized unnecessary losses through concentrated firepower, extensive intelligence gathering and maneuver warfare that the Wehrmacht simply couldn't match. Even German commanders acknowledged this in their after-action reports. They expressed shock at Soviet operational sophistication, the effectiveness of Maskirovka, the collapse of German fronts under multi-echelon assaults. Deep battle worked because it was doctrine, not desperation. The doctrine that Tukhachevsky conceived in the 1920s, that Stalin nearly destroyed in the 1930s, and that Zhukov perfected in the 1940s didn't die with the Wehrmacht. Deep battle remains foundational in Russian military thought and is studied worldwide. The U.S. Army's air-land battle doctrine of the 1980s drew directly on these lessons. Operational depth, multi-domain integration, striking enemy reserves before they could react. Russian new generation warfare continues adapting these concepts with cyber information and hybrid elements. The operational art that destroyed Army Group Center still shapes how 21st century militaries think about breakthrough, exploitation, and the brutal mathematics of modern war. From the mathematical brilliance of Tukhachevsky's theories to the smoking ruins of Army Group Center, deep battle proved that victory belongs not to the largest army, but to the most sophisticated doctrine, executed with precision. The Red Army that stumbled into 1941 with millions of casualties learned to coordinate multi-echelon offensives across 600 kilometers, synchronize 36,000 aircraft with 57,000 tanks, deliver 7,000 tons of supplies daily to the front. They transformed operational art into operational annihilation. This wasn't the human wave myth. This was the brutal mathematics of modern warfare perfected. Deep battle won World War II, and it's still winning wars today. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.